Welcome today at this seminar that we are organizing as the ERC group led by myself, Abstraction. And this event today is also promoted by Alma AI, our Center for Artificial Intelligence and the Humanities at the University of Bologna. We are very, very happy today to host a colleague of us that comes from the other side of the pond, from the other side, like comes from Oregon, USA, the West Coast of the United States, Mitch Reyes, or Reyes. Mitch is a full professor of rhetoric and media studies at the Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, where he directs the Memory Studies Institute. And he's also affiliate faculty in data science. Professor Reyes' research is focused in two general areas of expertise. On one hand, he examines the socio-political impact of science and mathematics, and he studies how controversies get resolved in science, as well as the ways mathematical discourse, for example, algorithms, influence contemporary culture. And on the other hand, he researches memory. So how the ways in which groups of people collectively remember their past. His work has been groundbreaking in the field of politics and public memory, and the social consequences of collecting memory practice. He wrote a book recently that was published, and it's an award-winning book by the title The Evolution of Mathematics, a Rhetorical Approach. And this book brings these two areas of research together in a study of algorithms and AI memory practice. So I have been knowing Mitch for quite a long time, almost 10 years. We met in Siena, Italy, where at the time I was working, and he came also for work. And I am really, really happy that today we can host a seminar by him, and a seminar on a topic that is so cutting edge and so important nowadays, namely a topic that stimulates us to find bridges between disciplines, right? So it's not just one discipline, but it's connecting interests and research focuses across disciplines to find new pathways for research. So I don't want to say anything more now, and I will pass the floor to Mitch directly. Mitch, I think you have 45, 50 minutes or so, and then we will open the floor to questions also from, okay? So thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Grazie tutti. Se devo parlare in italiano, questa presentazione forse prende 2 giorni, così parlo in italiano, no, parlo in inglese, va bene? Grazie. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure and an honor to speak at the oldest university in all of Europe. And it's just wonderful to be able to share these ideas with you. Chatbots are everywhere in contemporary culture these days. We're literally swimming in chatbots for this and chatbots for that. And so a question that many of my students come to me with is, what the heck are these things? How do they work? Why do they work? You know? So I want to address that question today. Why are they biased? Like, why would a computer system have bias? This is a question we should understand better because they are so powerful. So if these machines have bias, then that bias spreads, it amplifies by a factor of 10, 20, or 100. So it's a big problem. So in this talk, I want to address these questions. as we explore the algorithmic infrastructure of chatbots. So that's one of the, I kind of listed here some of the bigger ideas that I want you to take away from this talk. And one of them is the idea of algorithmic infrastructure, that every sort of big data computational technology communication is made up of a complex infrastructure of algorithms and neural networks. And algorithms are not unbiased. Algorithms are complex assemblages of decision making that have been made on our behalf for a particular purpose. Right? So I never want my students to think algorithms are neutral, because they are not neutral. In fact, they are trying to nudge you, to push you, to get you to do things they want you to do, like click on that advertisement, for example, right? And they are designed specifically to get you to do that. So they are not neutral. That's the wrong way to think about algorithms. Instead, think about them as complex assemblages of decisions that have been made on your behalf. Do you want to understand what those decisions are? I do. It's really important. So that is algorithmic infrastructure. And I try to teach my students how to understand how to dig into that algorithmic infrastructure to unveil, to reveal the decisions that are being made for us. Because if we don't, then we don't know what those decisions are. And we are ignorant of those decisions. So I hope to help us understand algorithmic infrastructure and chatbots not as neutral, but as biased towards particular end goals, and therefore they are artificial rhetorical agents. They are agents of culture. They are not just machines that we can pick up and put down. They are active agents that are changing our social material world in an active way. So they are not passive machines. It's not like a car. Like, I guess if it's an autonomous vehicle, it might be like a car, but not like an old car. Like, you know, they have agency in a way that the traditional machine does not have agency. That's another important idea, and that's what artificial rhetorical agency is about. Is capturing that idea that machines can have agency too, not just humans. So these artificial rhetorical agents have incredible potential. They have potential to do all sorts of things. And I think we need to think through what kinds of things we want these artificial rhetorical agents to do. Do we want them to maximize click-through behavior on human users? Or do we want to make them work to support the values of liberal democracy? They can do both those things. But right now, all they're doing is the work of capitalist extraction of value. And the question is, can we make them do work to do other kinds of things than just capitalist extraction of value? So the potential of these artificial rhetorical agents is to be harnessed. It could be to be harnessed to strengthen democratic cultures or destroy them. Just as these artificial rhetorical agents could help or hinder efforts to address the existential crises that are facing us right now, the crises of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is a geological era. How many people in here have heard of the Anthropocene? So you know a little something about it, right? So the way I think about the Anthropocene is it presents a series of problems to us as a human species at the global level that we've never dealt with before. And we have to come up with different responses than we have come up with before. That's part of the challenge of our times. And it's big and it's difficult and it's scary as hell. But we have to come up with something if we're going to find our way through the Anthropocene. Okay. So to highlight the stakes that are involved in this contemporary cultural moment, I want to just show you the standard terms of service of using one company among many, MailChimp. Most of us never read these things. We just click accept and move on with our lives. But they have become so bold and so all-inclusive today that I think it's worth our time to pause and look at what we're accepting when we use the quote unquote free, the free technologies of communication that companies like MailChimp, Google, and Meta provide to us. So let me just read through it. Without limiting MailChimp's rights, otherwise set forth in these terms, by using the AI model, you hereby grant MailChimp and their agents, employees, officers, directors, independent contractors, affiliates, subsidiaries, and representatives a worldwide, non-exclusive, irrevocable, transferable, royalty-free, fully paid up, sub-licensable through multiple tiers, licensed to access, use, modify, display, publicly perform, distribute, copy, create derivatives from, including derivative works of, and process any and all inputs and outputs, including any intellectual property contained therein. That's amazing to me. And it's un po' pazzo. It's a little crazy, right? Because what this means is that if you give MailChimp enough of your ideas, enough of your image, they will have rights to reproduce your likeness forever across the world in an uncontrolled, uncontained way. And you all probably know that there are technologies now that can take 5 minutes of you on video. I'm being recorded right now. You all have enough data of me to make me say anything you want me to say. And that's true for every one of us. And we're signing away this data. So one of the questions I think we have to ask ourselves in this moment is the question of the value of data. How much should it be worth? And how much should we be getting for the data we're giving to these major multinational corporations? And should we be signing MailChimp's standard use of service contracts? I think the answer is increasingly no. We're starting to realize, I think at the level of the individual citizen, what the power of data really is. And when I talk to my students about this and they say, well, I don't have anything to hide, I say, you fundamentally misunderstand the power of data. The power of data is not about your past. The power of data is about your future. Right? Reproducing your likeness isn't about who you were. It's about making you say something in the future. Something that's advantageous to a particular group, a particular company, for whatever reason I can't even imagine. But the power of data is not about what you've already done. It's about what you might or could or be made to do. That's what bioinformatics is. Bioinformatics is about gathering data about you so that I know how likely you are to have a heart attack. I know how high your blood pressure is. Because that gives me information that I can sell to another company in the future. So data isn't about the past, it's about the future. That's a really, I think, important idea. So the work that I do comes out of this book that I recently wrote called The Evolution of Mathematics. And in that book, I make an argument generally that language and discourse is not representative of the world in the way that we typically think language and discourse is representative of the world. Like simple language, like a bottle, right? This is like, oh, well, this represents this thing in my hand. And that's called, we call that the representation paradigm of language. And that's how we operate in our everyday lives. And we must operate as if this is the desk and this is the chair. These things represent things in the world so that we can communicate with each other and make sense of the world at sort of a basic kind of naive level. And it's totally necessary. And humans will keep doing it. But Language and discourse does far more than simply represent. And so my book is trying to understand how we've created a contemporary culture where, I argue, mathematics has become the meta discourse, has become the discourse that shapes and constrains and transforms almost everything in culture. And so my book kind of takes us through the evolution of mathematics from the invention of the calculus, 1680, 1690, all the way to the creation of algorithmic culture in contemporary times. And what I'm trying to show is that mathematical discourse itself has transformed in that time. And it's transformed in a way that I describe as translative, where that mathematical discourse is increasingly less interested in representing a model, mathematically with numbers or with shapes or anything like that, and increasingly more interested in understanding this model as a system of relational networks. And if we understand the system of relational networks that makes up this model, not only will we understand the composition of this model at the most basic sort of molecular level, we will also be able to play with that composition. And we will be able to recompose, decompose, and transform radically this model into something else completely. And for me, what that captures is the idea that language or discourse, especially mathematics, isn't just about representing the world that's already there. It's about transforming and changing. And it's, for me, it's that idea, that theory of language and discourse translated that helps me understand everything from chatbots to algorithms to autonomous driving vehicles, right? To all of these machines that are artificial rhetorical agents, right? If language doesn't transform the world, then it couldn't have agency. But we know that language, and for me, mathematics is just a great example of this, an exemplar. But we know that language actually does transform the world. It doesn't just represent it. And therefore, it has agency. And mathematics is the language that I think best puts that on display. And we can see that in the rise of AI chatbots. And if you ask people, well, why are you scared of an AI chatbot? Like, why do you worry? It's because they have agency, is why we worry. It's because there are huge multinational corporations that can use these to learn about us. And there's going to come a moment in culture when these AI chatbots know you better than you know yourself. That's what bioinformatics is about. It's about learning the temperature of your blood so that we know you better than you know you. And if I have that data, if I have that information, that's incredibly powerful. It's incredibly predictive. It's terribly controlled. So for me, this theory of language or discourse as translated is really essential for understanding the kinds of machines that we're building. So let's dive in to AI chatbots and what they are. They are not your friend, but they can be made to perform as your friend or even as your lover, right? And that's what this image kind of captures, this idea of the intimacy with AI chatbots. And there is a whole industry that is currently emerging around precisely this, around building chatbots that can be your friend and can be your intimate partner, these kinds of things. Because we've produced a culture that creates an incredible amount of loneliness, right? And so many people are lonely and so many people are disassociated from others that this fills a need. But what are they really? Chatbots, at least to this point, are nothing more and nothing less than large language models, LLMs. Okay? And you might ask yourself, well, what the heck is that? What is an LLM? A large language model is something that uses probability and statistics to create a model of prediction. And you might ask, well, what is it predicting? What large language models predict is the most likely next word in a string of words based on the billions and billions of words that they can train. So you give a large language model the phrase, Dalmatians have spots that. And that large language model, because it's been trained on billions and billions of phrases about Dalmatians, would be able to fill in the most likely next word. Dalmatians have spots that cover their whole body. And the large language model would know that that has a high probability of being the next word. And that's what they do. Large language models do nothing more, nothing less than predict the next most likely word, one word at a time, one after the other. So, okay, but how do chatbots pass the bar exam? Bar exam is an exam in the United States that you take to be a practicing lawyer. And so they've been able to pass the bar exam without going to law school. And this is like an amazing kind of feat. It's like, how do they do that? To answer that question, we actually need a little more detail about these chatbots. So let's begin with the basics. I mentioned that large language models are probability statistical systems. Right? They use algorithms to predict the next most likely word in the string of words. But in order to do that, they actually create these fascinating things called meaning maps. And this is an example, a very simple example of a meaning map that a chatbot would use to try to figure out what the most likely next word is. And what you'll notice here in this meaning map is that the words alligator and crocodile are right next to each other. And the reason that they're right next to each other is because this particular chatbot was trained on a bunch of discourse that used alligator and crocodile like as if they were the same thing, right? Synonymous. And so words that are synonymous or are associated with one another on the meaning map get put next to each other. Okay? And likewise, you have a bunch of different kinds of fruit that are all closely associated with each other. You have a bunch of different kinds of animal that are all closely associated with each other. So what you start to see kind of visually is clustering based on the particular type or category of thing. And what these large language models can do is they not only understand that alligator and crocodile are similar, right, that they're synonymous with one another, but they also can predict what the most likely path is from alligator to fly. And they would be able to know, okay, it's very unlikely that the word fly follows the word alligator, right? But it might be the case that the word alligator is followed by the word bird more often. And so what these large language models predict is the most likely next word based on what they have been trained on. So this is the model of language that chatbots and large language models function on. They spatialize language. They turn language into a space, and then they use probability and statistics to navigate that space. So I want you to imagine this almost as like a topographical map, where you have on a topographical map, you have these lines that show elevation, right? And what these things are doing, LLMs, is they're using like basic calculus to be able to find the valleys and the hills. And that's how, and so they predict the next word. Okay, so we could go, I don't know how far you want to go into calculus right now, but for now, we'll just stick with the fact this metaphor of a topographical map, okay? And they learn how to navigate the spaces of language. So they fundamentally have to spatialize language for them to work. Now, early on in the creation of these chatbots, of these large language models, they have a lot of problems. The early large language models were too perfect. So what happened is, and I want you to think about like ChatGPT 1.0, ChatGPT 2.0, very earliest models. They predicted and produced the most likely word every time, all the time. And guess what happened? It didn't pass the Turing test. The Turing test is the test that a machine can pass where you're looking at a discourse and you can't tell whether it's a machine produced or humans. If you can't tell, that machine has passed the Turing. Does that make sense? Okay, so these LLMs, because they were perfect in the sense that they always produced the most likely next word all the time, 100% of the time. They produced a very mechanical, very repetitive, very obviously machine-like discourse. They could not pass the Turing test. And that was a problem. That was bad because the motivation behind creating these things is to trick people. Like to trick people into thinking that this is a person. Because if you can pass the Turing test, then you can create AIs that will date you. And AIs that will be your best friend, and AIs that will do therapy for you, and AIs that will teach you geometry, right? But if you can't pass the Turing test, humans won't accept it. So at a fundamental level, there's at least an ounce of deception involved in the creation of these large language models. In order to pass the Turing test, what the engineers realized was that if they just sprinkled in a little bit of error into the model, it produced much more human-like discourse. So error was coded into these early models by design. Now, sometimes you might have heard people talking about, especially engineers, talking about ChatGPT hallucinating. Has anyone heard that idea of hallucination? As if it's accidental. Oops, it hallucinated again. Not true. It was designed to hallucinate. This error was coded into the large language models on purpose so that they could mimic human discourse more effectively and pass the Turing test. Deception. Why did they want error? To make their discourse more credibly human. And this is why chatbots sometimes hallucinate. It's why they make stuff up sometimes. And interestingly enough, this concept of encoding error by design, it's called temperature. So if I code a large language model to produce the exact most probable next word 80% of the time, and then 20% of the time I say, produce like the third or fourth most likely. That will be a temperature of 0.8. And that's how the engineers think about, I think it's fascinating the association between probable correctness and temperature, especially in the anthropos. It's just fascinating to me. So the phenomenon of encoded error reveals a lot, I think, about chatbots and about the motivations behind the construction of these chatbots. For instance, it reveals that their primary design goal is about deception and the capitalist extraction of that deception. That's the primary design goal right now of large language models. I want to underscore it doesn't have to be the primary design goal, but so far, that's what we've been creating chatbots for. So to be credibly human, to pass the Turing test, error had to be encoded into the models. And I like to think, what does this mean in terms of how these AI chatbots perceive us, perceive humans? And I think it's inevitable that you have to conclude they perceive us as error-prone. They perceive us as suboptimal in our decision-making. And that's why you're also going to see chatbots produced that not only will help you with therapy or help you with your geometry homework, but will help you make better decisions, more optimal decisions, less emotional decisions, less haphazard decisions. That will also happen in the future because there's money to be made in it. So from the perspective of the LLM, to be human, one must have error. And this is both a throwback and a departure. It's a throwback in the sense of the idea of the human in the hands of an angry God, right? That ancient, like, Old Testament idea of God and humans as falling into sin and being error-prone in that sense. So it's a throwback in that sense, but it's also a departure in the kind of enlightenment idea of the human as the rational animal, right? The animal that can use one's brain, cogito ergo sum, like I think, therefore I am. So it's a departure from that idea of the human. So there's a fascinating notion of humanness that gets produced from out of the algorithmic structure of large language models. Okay, so we've been talking about ChatGPT, and I wanted to start there because we're all familiar with that. But let's talk a little bit about algorithms now as the kind of infrastructure of these artificial rhetorical agents. In the most basic sense, algorithms are sifting machines. If this, then one. If not this, then zero. Simple, right? So if-then statements that instruct a computer on how to sort data. What could possibly go wrong with that? That sounds so beautifully neutral and wonderful. Well, a lot, it turns out, can go wrong. Problem one, algorithms are designed by people, and we are the problem. As ChatGPT has already made clear, we are error prone. Okay? And one kind of error we make, we call bias. And unfortunately, about 90% of our biases are unconscious. So even if you don't mean to, you'll be making kind of biased decisions without even knowing consciously that you're. Problem two, people have these biases. They are often unconscious. And problem three, those biases get coded unconsciously, sometimes consciously, mostly unconsciously, into the algorithms themselves. And the problem with that is algorithms are amplifications. They are prosthetics of human power. So if I have a bias, and all I have is my voice to share that bias, well, it's contained in this room, for example. But if I have a bias and I write it in a book, suddenly that's a prosthetic. Right? It can go out into the world. It can influence many, many more people. Now, if I take that bias and I integrate it into an algorithm, well, the limits and the power of that algorithm are global. And I can influence possibly billions of people. That's, for example, Facebook or Twitter, or these kinds of new media technologies. But what about learning algorithms? So that's just like simple algorithms. If-then statements are simple algorithms, but there's this other kind of algorithm called a learning algorithm. And these are the sort of essential pieces of the algorithmic infrastructure of something like ChatGPT. And unfortunately, there's some bad news there. Because learning algorithms are trained on massive amounts of discourse from the past that's been scraped from the internet, often illegally, mind you. What this means is that algorithms, too, have the biases of the past written into them, right? So, for example, one of those biases comes in simply the sheer number of kinds of faces that are on the internet. And it turns out there's roughly 10 times more white faces than black faces on the internet. So when you're building a facial recognition technology for the police, right, to find bad guys, those facial recognition technologies are going to be inherently worse at correctly identifying black faces than they are white faces, because the algorithms just don't have as much data. And that is a kind of what we call structural bias within the structure of the culture that we produce, the internet that we produce. There's just more whiteness than there is blackness. It's not on purpose, right? The engineers aren't these horrible racists. And yet, police departments in my country and all over the world are using facial recognition technology to try to locate crime, but even perhaps more terrifyingly, to locate whether someone is homosexual or not, to locate whether someone is lesbian. And there are big companies selling these kinds of facial recognition applications to places, to companies, to nation states that want to eliminate those things from their culture. So there's a lot at stake in these structural biases that we're finding. So again, algorithms are not neutral arbiters of culture. They are complex assemblages of decisions that have been made on our behalf. So it's incredibly important that we learn how to open up the black box and reveal those decisions. I call that the horizon of judgment. That there is a horizon of judgment within every complex algorithm. And we need to be able to figure out how to reveal those judgments that have been made for us, so that we understand whether we agree with them or not. And if we don't, we can interrupt them. But we can't do that unless we learn how to take these algorithms out of their black box and unravel them. That's kind of what I try to do. Okay, last big concept, the anthropos. And more importantly, what the heck does it have to do with ChatGPT and algorithmic culture? So the Anthropocene, you probably know, is a geological era. It's a geological era in which the anthropos, that's us, has become so influential that our species is starting to bend the curvature of evolution. And so you've had for many hundreds of years, thanks to Darwin, the idea of biological evolution. In recent times, with the rise of the Anthropocene, you have the idea of cultural evolution. And sometimes biological evolution and cultural evolution walk in the same path. And sometimes they fight against each other. And so the Anthropocene is a concept that's trying to capture the influence of cultural evolution on biological evolution. And to understand how speciation is changed by virtue of cultural evolution, by virtue of the influence of human action on our Earth system. But as I said before, the Anthropocene is also a new exigence. It's a new problem. It is, I like to think of the Anthropocene as the voice the Earth is trying to use to talk to us and say, wake up. What are you doing? You can't keep doing this. It's not that simple. So it's a new exigence, and it demands a new collective response. And by that, I mean the anthropocentric politics of culture around the globe has to be disrupted. We can no longer afford to play the politics of self and other in an anthropocentric way that pretends that our collective action isn't reshaping the Earth system. We are, and we're doing it rapidly, faster than anyone thought was possible. Even the scientists that were, I mean, if you've gone and you've looked at the predictions of Earth sciences from the 80s and the 90s and the aughts, they were all wrong because they were too conservative. Things are heating up faster than the scientists predicted. So it is an incredible exigence, and my hope is that we can figure out a way to meet it. I argue that understanding language and discourse as translative is a way of understanding that what we're doing is changing the reality of our Earth. That we're not just representing it, we're not just making money, we're actively transforming reality. And it happens to be a reality that we depend on for our livelihood. So we need a new paradigm. We need a new way of doing politics. And as far-fetched as this sounds, it's got to be at the global scale. It can't be at the level of the nation state, or it won't work. Like if you get one country to do something and then none of the other countries do it, that doesn't work. So the Anthropocene is a call to which we must respond. The Anthropocene marks our collective vulnerability to conditions that could well end our existence. The Anthropocene demands a double vision. So what do all of these things have to do with democracy, you might ask? This is one of the more important questions I think we have to wrestle with. And the question in my mind begins something like this. Can liberal democratic culture survive in the era of AI? I don't know the answer to that. I fear the answer is no. But I also think the answer could be yes. I fear that it's no right now because of the way that generative AI is being marshaled. It's not working for liberal democracy. It's working for late capitalism. And I see those two things as kind of diametrically opposed. So this is a question where I think I need your help, that we all need to think collectively together about how we can harness the power of generative AI to support the values and beliefs that we want to share with one another, to build better community. So oftentimes democracy is talked about only as a form of government, as a governance. But I think democracy is actually much more than that. Democracy has an ontology, a kind of beingness. So if democracy is a being, what kind of being is it? It's a being that only adapts and grows discursively. It is fundamentally a linguistic being. Democracy does not exist without language, without discourse, without argument, without debate. That is the lifeblood of democracy. So as a being, democracy only adapts and grows or fails to adapt and grow discursively, as a discourse, as a linguistic being. And there are many examples across the world of this, but in my own culture, in the United States, I think about the moments of crisis in my history of democratic culture. Something like in the 1800s, when we had a civil war, or in the 1930s, when we had the Great Depression. And I think then about the greatest speakers, the greatest leaders in the history of American culture. And lo and behold, they line up with the crises that have come to us. Lincoln was there to answer the call during the Civil War. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was there to answer the call of the Great Depression. And I bet if you look back in your own history of democratic culture, and you look back to the crisis moments, you will find someone emerged, or many people emerged, that came up with the new ideas, the new discourse that could deal with the new problem, the new situation, the crisis. And that discourse gave a rebirth to the nation state. That's the kind of being that democracy is. It's something that is born, that grows old, that can get quite staid and stodgy. And my favorite word in Italian, scontroso, can get grumpy, right? But it can also be reborn in a way that us humans cannot. So it's a discursive being. And that's kind of a beautiful idea that any democracy always has available to it its own rebirth, its own transformation, which is why I tend to think that democratic culture is maybe holds the most hope for us in terms of dealing with the problems of the anthropos. Because it is adaptive in a way that monarchy, that oligarchy is not. So our contemporary crisis is organized around global warming, around ecological collapse, around species extinction. And these are unique crises that we have to address. Might AI chatbots be the answer? Might we be able to marshal the most powerful communication technology to be created since electricity? That's what I would argue. I would argue that generative AI is going to change the world as much as electricity's invention changed the world. We're only at the very beginnings of the power of this technology. Might we then be able to capitalize on this moment, this opportunity, to take just a little piece of it and use it to defend, to bolster, to strengthen democratic culture, to strengthen things like free speech rather than close the back, to strengthen things like the distribution of wealth, rather than to concentrate it into the hands of the few. Regarding the chatbots of today, I think the answer is highly unlikely, right? Because these chatbots have been designed for capitalist extraction. That's what they're designed to do. Gather data, gather information on you, get you to click through on a particular advertisement more regularly so they can sell you to another advertiser. It's all capitalist extraction. We haven't yet started to produce generative AI that can defend our most cherished values. And until we do that, I don't have high hopes for democracy surviving. But the chatbots of the future could totally do that. It wouldn't even be that hard to do that. And for that, then my answer is maybe, or hopefully. I think that's the silver lining of the rise of these new communication technologies. That they're the most powerful rhetorical agents that we've ever created. And they could be marshaled to defend and support democratic culture in a way that we've never done before. So how do we harness AI to address the Anthropocene and bolster democracy? This is where I need your help. There are infinite possibilities, as there always are with a powerful new technology. Here are some that I can imagine. I can imagine studying the social material force of database technology. That's a really important aspect of how to respond to these new AI. And there are people doing this. Sasha Guccione is doing some incredible work around the carbon footprint of these large language models. Because when you think about what they have to be trained on, we're talking about trillions and trillions and trillions of words and huge computer systems that are using tons of power. And so there's some really great work out there already, kind of measure what's the carbon footprint of ChatGPT-4. Turns out it's pretty big. So that's really important. I can also imagine creating a kind of defensive AI chatbot. Let's call it Yoda. And each one of us would have our own little Yoda that was disconnected from all the systems, because if you connect it, it'll be hacked. So you can't connect it, but it will tell you when you're being manipulated. Because the systems of manipulation that are going to be created are going to be so sophisticated that most people won't be able to see it. So you're going to need an assistant. And my idea is to call it Yoda. We'll need to write laws to regulate the rise of generative AI. And this is already happening. That's the good news. In the state of California alone, last year, there were 407 bills that had already been written to try to regulate the influence of AI and chatbots. So that will happen. And we'll have to write policy to compensate individuals fairly and strengthen rights to privacy. A lot of times when I talk about the right to privacy, my students think, again, I have nothing to hide. Why should I care about the right to privacy? And I tell them, privacy is not about your past. Privacy is about your future and how much control you want to have over your future. That's what privacy is about. We could use generative AI to quantify ecological value, the value of a park in our city, or the value of a natural wild space. And if you can quantify that rigorously, you can then incorporate that into the capitalist decision-making that is absolutely going to happen. We're not going to get rid of capitalism. So this idea is, how do we integrate the value of green space, the value of ecology, into those decision processes? We could build a generative AI chatbot designed to distribute wealth rather than concentrate wealth. And I think there are already some really interesting ideas around this notion of distributing wealth. So Bitcoins and these kinds of different coins, the money of the future. I think there's ways to think about how a company could give you a coin that they create in order, in recompense for the data that you give in. And then you're creating a new currency of exchange, and you're actually getting something for the user data that you're getting. And we could develop a democratic values generative AI. And this is a distinction that a lot of people already are making in engineering fields around AI. The difference between object-oriented AI, right? There's an objective that they have, and you design an AI system to achieve that objective versus value-oriented AI and starting design. And as far as I know, we haven't gotten very far on the value side of generating generative AI, but I suspect that that will happen. The important thing, I think, is what Polanski says here. The tools that are used to mislead and misinform, to manipulate us and nudge us, could equally and quite easily be repurposed to support democracy rather than to undermine. And that's kind of where I see my work at the convergence of all these complex forces: discourse of mathematics, anthropos, rise of algorithmic culture, chatbots. These are all part of a massive convergence that's creating new problems for us. They're fascinating and terrifying at the same time. And I hope to think through them with you. So thank you for your time.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much, Mitch. I'm sure there are many questions, either from here or from home. Let's see, chat. Okay. No? And if not, I can, while people think about questions and comments they may want to ask our speaker, I'll start with the question. So I was thinking that there was one sentence that you said about the error and us humans being error prone. And you said, how do language models may perceive us? How do they perceive us? They perceive us as error prone. And I was wondering, wait, do they perceive at all? Do they perceive at all? And so and then I started thinking, I liked a lot the idea of intending these tools as rhetorical agents, so with agency. At the same time, it feels like if we give them we grant them agency in a way, I feel like it's like moving the spotlight onto them and hiding who is behind the scenes in, the OpenAI or the corporations that are actually inserting the error that they want to inserting. So I think it might be dangerous to talk about these agents as agents, because in that way we move the spotlight and we kind of forget that behind the scenes there is
human agents.
Yes.
Yeah.
What do you?
So yeah, I thought about that a lot, because the last thing I want to do with my work is give multinational corporations a free pass.
No, exactly.
It's terrible. So what I tend to think is 80% of responsibility has to fall on the major multinational corporations for creating. But 20% is the actual agency of the artificial agent itself. That, for example, there have been numerous occasions where OpenAI's, for example of ChatGPT, OpenAI's best engineers are completely flabbergasted by something that ChatGPT does, and they cannot explain. They do not know how or why it did the thing that it did. There is a kind of agency in that I think we need to make room for. So I guess I would say we need to do both of those things. We absolutely need to continue to hold major multinational companies responsible for the machines that they produce. At the same time, we need to also be open to the idea that machines might actually have their own agency and power too. I guess it's something, even a simpler example, with an older communication technology. Have any of you ever been in a situation where you're writing and it takes on a life of its own? You're writing something and the story takes you somewhere you didn't expect to go. You don't know how it happened. Turns out it's like your best idea, you know? And it just happened. What that does for me is it underscores the agency of language and discourse. That discourse doesn't just represent the world or my thoughts about the world. It actually has its own agential power. And if that's true, that written discourse as a form of communication has its own small amount of agential force or power, then I think what we're dealing with ChatGPT is the amplification of that agential force. Does that make sense?
Yes. Are there any other questions? I'm going to stop sharing the screen, maybe. Stuck. So that we can see. I guess now you can only see the webcam, maybe. Are there any more questions from
Yes, in the back.
two questions from here? Out loud.
Sorry, I can't. Oh, yeah, so an unbiased system. I don't think it's possible to make a completely unbiased system. Rather, I think it's possible to correct biases that are doing harm, to interrupt those biases and produce biases towards the things we want in our culture. I am biased towards free speech, for example. I would like to create AI systems that are also biased towards free speech. The problem with free speech is you have to tolerate hearing things you don't want to hear. That's the hard part about free speech. But it's worth it for the culture that you get to live in as a result. So a completely unbiased system, I think that is probably a fantasy. But a system that is biased in the ways that you want it to be biased, I think that's possible.
And we had another question here from the room, out loud, so we can maybe
About the last thing we say is we have to make these big companies aware of the power they have at home. They are basically ruling our research in a certain sense. We are written to say just how powerful is a tool or another tool. We are making a real research
Yeah.
I'm just trying to explain something that someone has created and that doesn't know how it works. But in your opinion, how can government, for example, try to put this company on the right path? Because I mean, if they are multinational and they are interested, economic interests over a while, how can we control?
Yeah.
They ask from home whether you can summarize the question.
Yes, I will try. So as I understand it, the question is about how governments can appropriately regulate the production of generative AI. I wish I had a good answer. It's this question that underscores for me why I think it's so important for my students to learn both the consequences of these new AI, like the implementation consequences on culture, but also know something about the construction side of building generative AI. Because we need people on both sides. We need people who are helping governments to regulate, who understand the intricacies of the algorithmic infrastructure that is making decisions on our behalf. And we need people who understand the implementation consequences of ChatGPT. For example, on institutions of higher education, where any student can produce an essay in any language in 15 seconds. This is a new problem, right? So we need people on both sides of it. And ideally, what I try to do is teach my students to be a bridge between the construction side of building these technologies and the implementation side of using them in culture. I think that governments will be better able to create policy that's effective if they have people in the room that are both the construction side and that can open up the black box, and people who are on the implementation side who can understand the effects of culture. And if you get those people to talk to each other, you have a better chance. Governments, that said, are always going to be chasing the tail of the rabbit.
There is another question. Would you like to come and ask the question in the microphone so that people from home can also hear?
Okay, I'll repeat it. Yeah.
Okay.
Are you saying, do we need new institutions to do this? Probably. I'm thinking of the book, The Ministry for the Future. Has anyone read this book? It's by a pretty well-known author, Kim Stanley Robinson. It's a beautiful book. And the Ministry for the Future is an institution. It's a book that projects human society into the future. And it's a international institution whose job it is to try to help us navigate our way through the Anthropocene. We're going to need something like that. And it's going to have team. It's going to have power of influence. It's going to have economic power to be effective. So yes, I think we're going to need international infrastructures. That's what we really don't have. We don't have strong international infrastructures. And that's going to require countries like the United States to change pretty radically. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that change will happen until there's a massive cataclysmic event where a heat dome is created and millions of people. That will probably happen. But if that event forces the United States to wake up, but yes, to answer your question simply, we're absolutely going to need international
Infrastructure.
international infrastructures. One of the ideas that I'm familiar with is kind of having a Geneva Convention for AI technology. And this is something that's already in the works. So if you're interested in doing that kind of work, there is a job for you.
We have,
I mean, we have,
We have to try.
we have many international institutions who have made, for example, war and crime. They have this thing.
Yeah.
Depends on how powerful is the one who is doing those war crimes. Is powerful enough, I'm going to stay hand. Maybe
The question of effectivity rests on predicting the future. I cannot predict the future. And in fact, I think the future is less predictable today than it was yesterday. So in a way, that's a good thing. Because if you think things aren't very good right now, then you want the future to be different. Okay? And we have these incredibly powerful communication technologies that we've never had before. If we can get them to work for the things we want them to work for, the future could be quite bright. It could also be very dark.
we have a question from home, from the chat. What about the possibility to detect if a text is human or generated by AI? Softwares like GPT-0 use linguistic parameters like word frequency, clause length, like sentence length. No, neither, I think she wants to say, neither the degree of agentivity nor the kind of errors are concerns.
Are
Yeah.
are some of them?
Yeah, maybe, yeah. So GPT-0 doesn't
Yeah.
use.
So my understanding is that every technology that's designed to detect, whether it's human generated or AI generated, is designed to detect the last iteration of ChatGPT. For example, there are pretty good technologies that can differentiate or that can tell us whether a discourse was produced by ChatGPT 3.0. But ChatGPT 4.0, you can't.
Okay.
Right? So just like governments are always chasing the tail of the rabbit, so are these technologies chasing the tail of the rabbit. It's like the idea of credit, right? And so like your personal information, somebody hacks some system and they get your personal information. So then you have to buy protection from another company to be able to detect whether, right? It's just capitalism chewing on itself.
Okay.
But I don't think, as far as I know, there aren't any guaranteed ways that we know of to be able to detect whether like the latest ChatGPT has produced the discourse. So, for example, I know there are situations where professors like me have claimed that they know that a student used ChatGPT and is cheating and yada, 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 and they can't prove it in a court of law.
Yeah. Okay, are there any more comments, questions from the room or from home? Okay, then I would like to thank again Mitch for the wonderful. And thank everybody here in the room and everybody at home for taking part, and stay tuned for the upcoming seminars organized by Abstraction and promoted by Alma AI. So thank you once again. Have a nice evening, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.